Following the French Revolution, Sweden became a more open society than she had ever been before. The prospect of ownership of free land, impossible in Sweden, was now encouraged in America under the Homestead Act. In the year 1872, a people sought this promised land. From the far-off country of the Vikings, from a district known as Ryssby, 8 families set forth on a journey many times longer than that of the Israelites. Ryssby, the first Swedish settlement in Colorado.
Hello, my name is Dick von Bernuth. I'm a past member of the Ryssby committee, past chairman of the committee, and I'm talking here with Dick Swanson, who has about 3 or 4 more centuries out there than I do. Well, Dick, the Ryssby Church was started actually when the cornerstone was laid in the building, was 1882, and it had a relatively short run then of about 23 years until the year 1905, and it was essentially deserted. What happened during that next few years then?
After, the church started to deteriorate in membership in the 1890s. At that time, the Elam Lutheran Church in Longmont started and drew a lot of the members of Ryssby into the Longmont area, particularly those members of Ryssby that had been living in Longmont or east of Longmont. So in the 1890s, the membership started to deteriorate quite a bit, so that in about 1900, there were very few members still going to the church at Ryssby. And if they did, they were alternating between Ryssby and Elam, or alternating between Boulder and Ryssby. And so that during that period of 1900s, the early 1900s, the church was vacant, except that the last entry into the protocol book was in 1905. But there wasn't much action, so that the area, that time between 1900 and 1924, the church was pretty much empty and had almost been abandoned.
Your great-grandparents are interred in the Ryssby there, or in the cemetery there at Ryssby, is that right?
Yes, yes.
Did they farm in that area, or what's the background there?
My great-grandparents came from Sweden along with the children in the 1880s. They came in 3 different groups. There were the 2 parents, of course, my great-grandparents, and 6 siblings. They came to this part of the country, but not part of the Ryssby congregation. They settled in the Longmont area, south of Longmont, and and in the Meade area. So they never really became part of the major Ryssby congregation. But at the same time, in 1910, when my great-grandfather passed away, he was living with my grandfather in a farm south of Longmont. My great-grandmother had passed away 2 years before that, and they also at that time were living in a farm south of Longmont.
Okay. You mentioned a little bit ago the year 1924. Was there a midsummer celebration there, or?
In 1924, Pastor Stromquist, along with Pastor Berg in Loveland, instigated a new midsummer in the Ryssby area. Midsummer is a pagan holiday, originated as a pagan holiday in the northern Scandinavian countries, along with the northern part of England, Great Britain. At the time that the Christians moved into Sweden, then that midsummer became a holiday resembling the Christmas holiday and the winter solstice. The midsummer is around the summer solstice, between the 18th and the 24th of June, and it's really first Christians celebrated it as the life of St. John the Baptist. So it took on a religious connotation, and since that time, it has been celebrated very, very strongly as a major holiday. Pastor Stromquist, being Swedish origin, along with Pastor Berg, thought that it's time that Ryssby then started a new midsummer event, and from then on it continued to serve the congregation, First Lutheran, Elam, and at that time the Ryssby congregation. However, at 1924, the Ryssby congregation no longer existed as a congregation. It had been merged with Elam Lutheran Church in Longmont, and so there really was the Ryssby congregation, the Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church, Ryssby, Boulder County, lasted only about 26 or 27 years.
Yeah. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of activity, or at least not much record, between 1924 and 1938. Now, 1938 was notable for what reason? And what happened between those two?
I don't think that really much happened. In going back to some of the records, there were maybe 4 funerals in the 1920s, 5 or 6 funerals in the 1930s, and then in the 40s, 10 funerals, and then 50s and the 60s and the 70s, there were only 4 funerals in that span of 30 years. So really very little happened out there. The only thing that really of significance started in 1938 when the candlelight services started. And then the church started to function again.
Were those candlelight services carried on every year after that?
In 1938, yes. After that, it's been carried on every year from 1 service to 2 services, up to 8 services, and now there are 7 services and the candlelight services each winter on the second full weekend of December.
The restoration of the church to something which would resemble what we have now began in 1969. What can you relate from that?
That restoration is kind of a very major event because the Ryssby Church had fallen in disrepair during the period of time from 1900 to 1969. Not very much had been accomplished, that the Ryssby Church had just deteriorated. In fact, in the early 1900s, lightning struck the tower and the tower fell. So the church had been gradually falling apart. In 1969, Larry Nelson, with a group of folks, started a drive for donations to refurbish the church. And so the time between 1969 and probably 1976 or so, a major renovation of the church took place. They took a lot of bat guana out of the attic, put on a new roof, shingles that is. The roof was fine, the structure of the roof was fine, except they needed new shingles. They took the inside of the church and replaced a lot of the paneling. The major thing was that the southeast and the southwest corners of the church were falling apart. They were falling down. They needed a lot of repair. So those 2 areas took the major part of the reconstruction of the church. And at the same time, to make a more accommodating for the congregation, they put a door into the south corner where one of the windows had been previously, a door to make it more safe for the congregation to exit. And so that's when the new door on the south was replaced.
To repair those two corners that were deteriorating, they placed two really big steel rods all the way through the church. That was in what year do you suppose?
That would have probably been in 1975, 1976, something like that.
And at that same time then, they built a buttress on the east end of the church, what I would call a flying buttress, to hold up that end of the wall.
Yes, that's right. That's now our flower garden.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That appears to be the major construction at that time, and it seemed to be, from what I can read, the major construction of the church was completed in about 1976.
Was there a celebration or some kind of a dedication in 1976?
Not that I can recall. In 1978, there was a dedication of a new cornerstone, but that's about all I can find in the records. But I think another thing, though, that we have to recognize that not only was the church remodeled and severely the damage was repaired, but at the same time, in 1969, an irrigation system was developed for the church grounds. And I think that's probably one of the most important things that has happened in the history of Ryssby since the day one. Because it now, with the irrigation system, we can keep the church grounds much more pretty, useful. At the same time, during that phase of reconstruction, they planted some 50 trees. Well, the irrigation then handled that situation. However, what good was an irrigation system if you didn't have any water? So I think the neighbors in that particular area donated the water from 1869.
Did the acquisition of those water rights include the right to have drinking water there?
No, in 1977, the left-hand water district, that's the domestic water district, gave a water tap to Ryssby for use not only for drinking water, but for fire protection. So that would have been in 1977. It had separated completely from the left-hand ditch company water rights. Yeah. So we now own 20 shares of left-hand ditch water, and that's enough to irrigate the land once or twice.
Yeah. Changing the subject a little bit, when was the Cemetery Trust Fund started?
Cemetery Trust Fund is, according to the records that I read, was started in 1999. Up until that time, the money just went into the general collection of the church mixed with other funds. But in order to protect the rights of the cemetery and that to aid in the ability to preserve the cemetery, that was developed, the trust was developed at that time. And now it's called the Ryssby Church Perpetual Care Fund.
Right. Who were some of the committee chairmen down through those years that you remember?
I think that probably Dean Olander was a chairman for quite a while. I know he was chairman at the time that they purchased the 12 shares of left-hand ditch water, and that was a considerable sum at that time, and it frightened a lot of them on the Ryssby board at that time because that was a lot of money. But Larry Nelson, I suppose Lloyd Magny had served a term. Kent Anderson probably also served a term as chairman of the Ryssby committee. Prior to that, I don't know just how, other than the fact that Larry Nelson was a very prominent mover in the 1969 move towards refurbishing the church.
Ruthie Anderson was very instrumental in the conduct of meetings and keeping records for a lot of years.
She was the secretary of the Ryssby committee for many, many years. She kept not only the records of the meetings, but she would keep records of the weddings and the funerals, memorial services, and helped with Bill Bone in developing the records for the cemetery. But she was for many, many years, she was a strong, strong supporter.
Yeah. We now have a columbarium out there, and it's been quite active. What is the background and development of that?
In the 2000s, we could see that there was a lot of activity with the cemetery. There were several. One year, 25 lots were purchased, and another year, 14 lots were purchased. And we thought that, what are we going to do? We're going to run out of plots. So there was some consideration on how to accommodate those burials, and so we suggested a columbarium. At the same time, we recognized the fact that a lot of the mortuaries were being requested that instead of embalming and full burial, that a cremation take place, and that the cremation urn could either be placed in the ground or, in this situation, in the columbarium. Now, just to define what a columbarium is, to those who don't know, a columbarium is a place to place niches of remains into a structure rather than in the ground. So that in the year 2010, we investigated 2 or 3 different places, but we finally settled on a company in Scottsdale, Arizona. The Homecoming Incorporated is what it's called, and they built the columbarium, but they also then furnished niches and do the engraving on the facing of each niche on the columbarium. So that columbarium then on the far east end of the cemetery was dedicated in the midsummer of 2011. It has 48 niches on one side, and at that time that's the only side that we had furnished. In 2017, we found that all the niches on the side facing the church had been sold, and we needed more niches, so we added 48 niches on the opposite side of the columbarium. Of course, when the columbarium was built, this was the intent. It was built with the purpose that we could add 48 more niches on the other side. Yeah. And so since all of the 48 on the west side facing the church have been sold, we're now filling the niches on the east side.
When the bell tower came down, there was a bell in it, of course. The bell tower itself was taken across the street, and parts of it were used for a milk cooling house over there. The bell itself somehow wound up in the hands of Eleanora Benson, who was a cousin of my wife's father. It was with her for, I suppose 30 years at least, and then somehow it came from her to our house. And so my wife and I stored it for many, many years, and finally we realized that it ought to be back in that bell tower, and so we gave it to the church, gave it back to the church, and it was installed in the bell tower, and is still there and operates. In April this year, the old concrete that was in front of the church entry had been deteriorating some, so that it was
elected to add a new flagstone entry to the church that made it wheelchair accessible. So coming in from the west, the wheelchairs can roll right up to the church door. And it's a beautiful addition to the church entry, I think. Serves a very, very wise purpose.
Well, I'm Dick von Bernuth, and that's a German name. I'm Swedish by assimilation from my wife, who was a card-carrying Swede. Spent a number of years on the Ryssby committee and as chairman a couple of times. And I'm talking with Bill Bone. Bill is Mr. Ryssby. He's the guy who's been here forever, has been the caretaker, and just the confidant of many, many people. So he's the guy that has all the memories, and we're going to be talking with him. And well, Bill, this church was dedicated in 1882 and abandoned in 1905. That's kind of a short run. Do you know when they deserted the church, did they just simply lock the door and walk away, or what did they do?
That's my understanding. Well, no. By that time, another group had moved in close south and east of Longmont, another immigration group from Sweden, and they started their church where the Alberg Funeral Chapel is now. That was called Elam Church. They joined that, and then this stayed pretty vacant for quite a while. While it was vacant, lightning struck at the bell tower and knocked it down. The interesting thing about that, the little building across the road is built out of rock. That man that time took the rock from the bell tower and built a little milk house, and that's what the farmers used. In the summertime, they'd run irrigation water through a tank in these little buildings. That's all the cooling they had for the milk. I hope that stays, because that's the only one I could find in Boulder County.
So you moved here to the farm in 1941, and then you were gone from 38 till 50, till what?
51 through 54.
Yeah, okay. So when they started the renovation of the church, started to restore it, you weren't around then, or were you back periodically during that time?
Well, I think the major renovation, well, they did some, but the major renovation, when they remortared everything, that was in 1969, I think. I don't think they had very much maintenance from when you say they closed till the mid-30s, because I hear that's when they started having the Santa Lucia out here again. my first contact with Ryssby was in 1958 when they were decorating for the candlelight service, and they asked me to come down and build a fire. And I was just getting over crushed vertebrae, so I tried it and it wouldn't start on Saturday. This I have to share with you because this is my lasting, first and very important lesson I learned at Ryssby. So my dad and my father-in-law come down and emptied the stovepipes, and they got 2 5-gallon buckets of soot out of that. So the next day I come down to warm it up for the candlelight service. I bought some wood, put some coal from my dad's coal bin, come down and lit it. The 2 chandeliers were reversed that time, and they were using 1-bys on each cup, and they had 4 candles on each cup. Well, I started fire, banged it with wood, came back an hour later. When I left, there were 16 candles in this front chandelier. When I got back, there was 1. I melted them all. I bubbled paint on the pews. So made me a lasting impression.
So your first attempt at being a pyromaniac didn't quite work.
No, it didn't.
Thinking about across the road there, that was built. The house was built as a parsonage initially.
Yeah.
Was it? It was used as a private home, and who lived there, and how long was that?
Well, the first one, that family's surname was Hamilton, and they lived there almost all the time I got through high school. Shortly after that, Nick Student moved there, and he lived there even after his wife divorced. And then when Nick died, they were getting ready to sell it, so that's when the son brought in a drought hoe and knocked the house down and hauled it away.
Wow. The real restoration on the church here actually started in 1969, I believe, and there were several people who were the driving forces behind getting that done. Who were those people?
Well, I think Larry Nelson would come to mind first, and I think that in my memory, they used like a high school senior or college freshman from the church, and Larry did a lot of the supervising, and this young man did most of the mortar work.
Mm-hmm. Was the 2 steel rods, or the 3 or 4 of them, I guess,
Yeah.
that hold the thing together now, were put in during that same time?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Going back to the bell tower for a moment, when that thing came down, there was a bell in it. Well, somehow it wound up in the possession of Eleanor Benson, who lived near Berthoud and was a cousin of my wife. My wife was Colleen Swanson, so she was the card-carrying Swede. But that bell was in her possession until, I think, sometime in the late 80s. We finally realized what that thing was after she died. And so my wife and I brought that bell back out here and had it installed in the bell tower. So it is there now. But it's kind of a mystery what path it took to get where it went.
Yeah.
So the renovation was completed here basically in 1976. When did you become the caretaker of the
1988.
88, okay. So who was looking after it between 76 and 88?
Well, Larry did most of it, Larry Nelson.
Yeah.
And up until that time, it wasn't mowed very much at all. I can remember when right after I took over, and they had that little John Deere riding mower, I was mowing it for Memorial Day, and Leroy Vicklin come out and he said, "Wow, this is going to look the best it's ever looked for Memorial Day."
Yeah.
He'd never seen it mowed like that. Another thing I'd like to add in, Ed Anderson told me the first time he came to Ryssby, there wasn't a tree on the grounds. In fact, I have a picture that shows it without any trees.
Yeah, you sure wouldn't know that when you look around out there now. That's a pretty amazing transformation. Yeah, Bill, you started as the caretaker in 1988, and that was the same year, according to my records, that the restrooms and the shed were built. And was that Larry Nelson that pretty much was the driving force there?
I think the shed came later. We fought the mower for several years and then went to hiring it moved.
Yeah, okay. Somewhere in that same period of time, the flagpoles were installed out here on the west side. Do you remember how that happened and who gave those?
No, somebody mentioned to me the other day they thought it was somebody in your in-laws' family.
Yeah, it was Colleen's parents,
That's what
Hazel and Oscar Swanson.
Hazel.
They were
yeah,
the ones
Swanson.
that gave them.
Okay.
Yeah, but we've had the flags up there every year since then, I think, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, you. In fact, we have to rely on you to be sure we get the right flag on the right side, or the right flag on the left side. The words up above us here, which is not bad for a German.
That's what I was just going to compliment you on that.
Mean glory to God in the highest. Who was it that put the words up there?
I think that happened in about, I got to think back now, when, let me see, when Carl was in 21 years, got out in 09. I think that's about in the late 90s that Ralph Mingus, I think Ralph Mingus carved that. And that's when, as I remember, when they put the banner around.
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, Ralph Mingus. Okay, I couldn't remember who did it. Yeah, Ralph did. He did quite a bit of stuff out here. Now, committee chairman down through the years, when did they actually start the Ryssby committee, which took over management of the entire property? Do you recall?
No, it was, I can remember talking about the Ryssby committee, but I don't know. And then it was just selected by members of the committee.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say probably in somewhere in the 70s, Larry called me one day and says, "You've been appointed to the Ryssby committee." And when I hung up the phone and turned around, my wife said, "What's the shocked look on your face?"
And you said, "What is the Ryssby committee?"
No, I had an idea what it was, but again, was really surprised to get nominated to it.
Yeah. Larry was really a driving force in a lot of things with Ryssby, not least of which was raising money.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how he went about that.
Oh, he'd just go to his friends and say, "Well, we need a donation for Ryssby. Come help us out." And Larry was a different guy to figure out, but he was always very good to me.
He was difficult to say no to.
Oh, yeah.
And he did a good job. They raised quite a lot of money to support the place. Now, some of the committee chairmen, well, I remember Dean Olander was chairman for quite a few years, and that was when I came on that committee. How long do you suppose he was the chairman?
Well, he was chairman when we bought the first water. Ken Anderson, I think, preceded Dean. Dean must have been chairman, I would say, somewhere in the vicinity of 12 years.
Yeah. I think you're right. And Dean was a guy that kind of ran things with an iron hand, too.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the days before there was such a thing as an election for committee members. The water that we used to irrigate with, Bill, and you were the first one that ever irrigated the place, I think.
No, Kent Anderson did some, and Larry did some.
Oh, okay. Well, tell us what the water rights are and how that is administered.
Well, what water we get to irrigate the grounds comes from left-hand ditch company, and this is what they call the Table Mountain ditch. Under the left-hand ditch company, there are 7 other ditches. And the donor of the ground for Ryssby gave a verbal agreement to use his water. We never had any stock in the ditch or anything. And then many years ago, Jack Olson, who owned what's around us here, he gave us 1 share. Well, that at least gave us the right in the ditch, but we still didn't. So Dean was one of the first ones I pushed to buy water. So when I got the first chance to buy it, I saw some advertising in the paper, and it was on a Sunday morning, and I called, and the guy said, I will hold it till I hear from you. So I called Dean, and he said, and they were asking $1,200 a share. So I called Dean, and he said, oh, pretty high price, but you go to church, you ask the others. And so I got to church, and I already knew I had 3 of us. And 2 of the guys, when I got to church, said, you vote ours. We don't know anything about irrigation water. So we got 12, and then we got to add our 1 share, and I bought 1 share. But the $1,200 originally, the last went to 4,000, and it probably had 5,000 now. And I always say that free water or running water is liquid gold.
Yeah, you are.
It's going to get higher.
You are right. And the beauty of this area now certainly stems from the fact that we acquired that water and we're able to use it.
You know, if we didn't have that water, it'd be back like Ed Anderson told me, there would be nothing out here.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's one of the selling points when we sell plots in the cemetery or niches in the columbarium, is the fact that it does look so nice.
Some other just smaller items, I guess. The wrought iron fence that surrounds the property now, we built that, 7 years ago, I guess?
Something like that.
Before that, what was there around there for
Just
a fence?
the front and to this gate.
Yeah, just an old woven wire fence.
Yeah, chain link.
Yeah. Rusty Brockman had a pretty big hand in doing that, didn't he?
Yeah, I could remember before the chain link went in, Nick across the road had a bunch of goats, and they were always coming across and chewing the flowers off when people planted.
Yeah, we stopped the goats. The cows still get in every now and again from down below here. Have we had any major damage from that cattle herd back there?
Just upset 1 or 2 stones.
Yeah. Now, if you have a cemetery out in the country, you got to contend with a lot of different things.
Oh, yeah.
Fortunately, we haven't had any lightning recently. The columbarium was a pretty big change.
Oh, yeah.
Something we debated about for quite a number of years.
Well, it was coming because by the time we put the columbarium in, national average for cremations was crowding 60%.
Yeah, tell us what our concerns were about the.
Well, I think they didn't. My opinion is a lot of the people didn't realize what the percentage was of people going to cremation.
Yeah. And there was really some concern about whether it would actually be used.
Yeah, and it's being used very much.
Yeah.
In fact, it was a good thing for us to put it up because we were letting them put we're letting put 2 cremains or 1 cremains in 1 plot in the cemetery. Well, now they can put 2 cremains in each niche in the columbarium.
Yeah. One of our problems that we had the most trouble with was replacing the restrooms with the current facility. And you know a little bit about what we went through with that, what Floyd Edwards went through.
Well, so Floyd thought he was going to just walk in and buzz right through it, and Artie and I were chuckling. Well, when one of the inspectors came out one day, talked to Floyd just a few minutes, checked the checkoff list on the tree, and went back to Boulder. And the next thing Floyd knows, he's getting $850 bill for inspection. And the guy didn't even go there to the actual facility.
And it took the better part of 3 years to get that thing done, just to get through the permitting process. Well, Bill, I'm running out of questions. What else do you think of that you ought to talk about?
I just think I am been blessed to serve these people for so many years. I think I would call it my rewarding journey. Because there's people that, like I say, they still stop me and talk to me. And I hope you don't mind me putting this in, but one of the couples that I was married quite a few years ago here still come to the candlelight every year. And they were married here. And on my birthday a couple of years ago, I asked people to just give me reminders. And his story was when Bill starts to tell you a story, pull up a chair. He said, I met him in the grocery store one time. I had just bought a pint of ice cream, and I met Bill, and we started talking. When we got done, I had to go buy another pint of ice cream because mine had melted. Well, this, I think, is something that needed to be done for a long time.
Yeah.
To get other people, let them know what's actually going on. And you know, I have said for years that the new buildings, a new building can match the acoustics, but they won't beat the acoustics here.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
I had never been in the Brethren Church at Hygiene till a couple of years ago. And I had a similar look from the outside. And I don't know whether they leveled the ceiling off or what. But you have a meeting in there or some a group of people, I am lost. It's just a big buzz.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is pretty amazing what they did with this church. A bunch of unskilled people that built it.
Oh, yeah.
They couldn't have known what they were doing, but
blood, sweat, and tears.
Oh, yeah.
You try to get people to lift or by pulley or whatever some of the size of the rocks in these walls.
Yeah.
they'd laugh at you and walk away.
That's right.
A couple of years ago, I had a young woman call me and wanted to come look at the church for a wedding. And she came by herself, and she said she had traveled all over Europe and seen a lot of stone churches. And she never dreamt she would find one here where she could think about having a wedding. So I'd stand back there, and she started walking down here slowly. I grabbed a stick and rang the bell, and she did a turn around and come back double time. There were tears in her eyes. She said, "I found it, stone church with a bell." The other side of that is, there are people who drive by here every day that don't realize there's a cemetery back here.
Yeah. Which is probably a good thing.
Oh yeah, it's just, well, the other side of that is, we were really low for a long time, and I kept telling the committee we got to boost them up and boost them up. And a lot of people don't like this to hear this, but there are many people who were selling their loved ones out to save a few dollars on burial.
Yeah.
There's a couple of cemeteries that found that out the hard way. One of them ran out of room and has no more room to expand.
The management of the cemetery includes opening plots, selling plots and opening plots, closing them, doing the opening up the building for memorial services. You've had an enormous part in that. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think in the cemetery part, well, let me back up a little bit. The rewarding thing for me is the fact that I can help people have their happiest time when they get married, or help them when they lose a loved one, and that is even harder when the loved one goes with a permanent solution to a temporary problem, because there's too many questions left unanswered. But I go to people now when they walk and say, you help bury us, you help bury this. And I had one lady, complete stranger, she was talking to the mortuary, and she said, I want a simple service, plain service. And they had just told her she had to talk to me. So they said, well, we could go out and say a prayer. And her question back to them was, will Bill do it? So they said, you come and when you get out there to buy your plot, you ask him. And I said, I'll do it, but it won't be very big. So when it was all said and done, I asked her how that was, and she said exactly like I wanted it. And when the very first interment in the columbarium, just the widow and her son came out, and Dick Swanson was there with me, and we put the urn in and put the plaque on, and she said, now Bill, you'll finish with the prayer, won't you? And I said afterwards to Dick, she threw me a curve. He said, yeah, but you sure got straightened out in a hurry. But the people, when the suicide, I go a little bit further on suicide. My very first one really tore me up. And then Shepherd of the Hills came the next day to have their picnic and service here. And at that time, that was husband and wife co-pastors, and she came up early on a Sunday morning, and I came to open it. I unloaded on her, and she said, Bill, you've got to get that out of your head, because suicide is they're in such deep depression. We've never been there, so we can't understand it at all. But I've considered my whole thing through this my rewarding journey. I've met people that are still my friends. Like a couple of years ago coming up, my lady friend and I were waiting for a table on Valentine's Day one of my neighbors and fellow Legionnaire went out to greet us, or was going out, so he'd finished. He greeted us and walked out the door, and all of a sudden he come back in, double time, stopped in front of me and said, "Bill, do you remember what you were doing 45 years ago tonight?" I said, "No, but if you do, I must have been firing for your wedding at Ryssby." And he said, "You're right."
Those are awfully good memories from a lot of years.
I want to give this credit to his side of the family. One of the few times I've choked when people tell me something. When Dick's wife was buried out here and he came out, and Dick said, "Will you open so I can show my brother and sister-in-law?" I said, "Yeah." So after the burial, after graveside, the four of us were in here, and Dick told him about Ryssby. He and his brother started for the door, and his sister-in-law waited, and she came to me and she said, "I hope you realize the love and respect that whole family has for you." I choked, I couldn't say thank you, but that was one great compliment for me, and he's a cherished friend.
Yes, indeed. And it's been a good ride, Bill, for a lot of years.
Yeah.
It really has. Well, Bill, thanks very much for sharing a lot of your memories.